Paul, Ringo, John, and George. Ever heard of them? How about the Beatles? That name might ring a bell. The rock pop sensation quickly grew to be one of the most recognized bands in the history of music. But how did they get there? What trials and tribulations did this band face on their way to the top? Coming together in Liverpool, England in the year 1956, the band originally consisted of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. In March of that year, Paul brought his friend, guitarist George Harrison, to one of their performances, and he soon showed interest in joining the up-and-coming musical group. At first, Lennon was on the fence about George joining the band due to his age and lack of maturity, but after a persuasive audition and months of persistence, George Harrison was enlisted as the band's lead guitarist. In 1960, Stu Sutcliffe was added to the roster as the band's lead bassist. In the early days of their music, they went under the name the Quarrymen. Stu Sutcliffe suggested they change the name to the Beatles to pay tribute to Buddy Holly and the Crickets. For a short period of time, they were called the Silver Beatles, but eventually settled on the band's trademark name that was immortalized forever. In 1961, the band saw a lot of big changes. Not only did they begin touring internationally, but the band was still incomplete without a drummer. That was until manager Alan Williams hired drummer Pete Best for their performances. That same year, they also lost a key member to their ensemble. Stu Sutcliffe left the Beatles to pursue art school, leaving Paul to take up the mantle as the band's lead bassist. They began their international movement by booking a residency in Hamburg, Germany. After completing 2 residencies in Hamburg, the group grew tired of playing in the same locations for so long, and knew they had the potential to score a record deal. At one of their performances, they met Brian Epstein, who went on to become their manager in 1962. Epstein took charge and landed the Beatles a record deal with George Martin of Parlophone Records. The Beatles soon began attending recording sessions with Parlophone. However, producer George Martin grew unsatisfied with Pete Best's drumming ability, which ultimately led to his dismissal from the band. Best was replaced with Liverpool drummer Ringo Starr, forming the iconic band lineup that is so popular today. During their third recording session, the Beatles recorded some of their first hit songs, Please Please Me and Love Me Do. In February of 1963, the band released their debut album with the same title as their number 1 song, Please Please Me. The top tracks on the album caused quite a craze for Beatle fans, with Love Me Do reaching number 1 on the Billboard's Top 100 chart. Title track Please Please Me followed close behind, reaching number 3 on the chart. A few years later in 1964, the Beatles released their first American album, Meet the Beatles, through Capitol Records. This album was monumental for the band and started a phenomenon known as Beatlemania. It also contained some more of their popular songs, I Wanna Hold Your Hand and All My Love. Weeks after the release of Meet the Beatles, they made their American television debut on The Ed Sullivan Show, where over half the American population tuned in to view their legendary performance. 1964 proved to be a great year for the Beatles, as they became the first ever musical group to take up the top 5 slots on the Hot 100 chart, a record that the Beatles still hold to this day. Fast forward to 1966, the band had already released several more albums with Parlophone Records, and even starred in 2 feature films, A Hard Day's Night and Help. Everything was looking great for the Beatles, setting records and becoming a pillar in the musical community. It wasn't until John Lennon was interviewed on the Evening Standard that the tides began to shift in terms of the band's approval. While being interviewed, Lennon made the statement that the band is more popular than Jesus, causing people to protest and burn their Beatles albums and memorabilia. Lennon later apologized for his comments, but this still showed the band in a negative light in many parts of the country. In August of 1966, the Beatles made the decision to stop touring after growing frustrated with the behavior of their fans during performances, performing their final concert after 4 straight years of touring at the Candlestick Park in San Francisco. The Beatles didn't stop there, though. In 1967, the band released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which differed greatly from the band's previous albums. The style of music featured on the album was dubbed their first art rock album due to its avant-garde nature. It's said the Beatles never had any intention of performing those songs live, so they recorded them in ways that would be difficult to recreate on stage. The Beatles released their last recorded album, Abbey Road, in 1969, which spent over 500 weeks on the Billboard Top 200. Several months later, in 1970, Paul McCartney made his departure from the band official, responding to a journalist saying, "The Beatles no longer exist." Following the release of their documentary, Let It Be, They released their final album under the same name, containing pre-recorded sessions from their final years together as a band. On December 8, 1980, the shocking news of John Lennon's murder left the world distraught. The 40-year-old singer was shot by overly obsessive fan Mark David Chapman outside his apartment in New York City. Lennon's death was followed by the death of George Harrison in 2001, following his battle with lung cancer. As for Paul and Ringo, they are still making music and sharing their talent all over the world to this day, collaborating with other artists like Stevie Wonder, Joe Walsh, and Kanye West. But today, the Beatles are a known household name with many musical creations that are still being listened to every day. Without a doubt, their work will continue to live on and be remembered forever.